Good evening. I'm speaking with Shyamala Gomez, a lawyer, an activist, many things, but I think today we are going to just speak about your involvement, and it has been for a very long time, I know of, in dealing with sexual violence and gender-based violence. Shyamala, perhaps you can begin by explaining to us, because the audience is wide and varied, what are the dimensions of sexual violence in our country?
Sanjana, I'd like to talk really about violence against many facets, because violence against women we typically think of as being only sexual violence, but then there's physical violence, there's emotional violence, there's economic violence, sorry. So these are different aspects, you know, along with the sexual violence that comes along with it. I think, and sometimes we tend to forget what the other aspects of violence. So in this country, we would talk about violence in the public space, violence in the community, violence in the home. So there are many facets to violence, and I think, you know, we need to sort of talk about all of these different aspects of it.
Is there always and always has been the risk of the larger, you know, the discussion, the debate, the understanding and the awareness of violence? It is a bloody country after all, and it is a bloody country because of the ethno-political, the communal violence and hatred. But is there the danger of that definition or understanding of violence overshadowing what you just said?
I suppose it sometimes could, and I mean also the fact that you know, what happens in the country would affect or maybe have some kind of impact on the incidents of violence that do take place. So you would have violence, you know, because of the conflict, due to the military, due to the different, you know, actors that are involved. So you would have those aspects also coming in. So I would think there is a direct link between the two.
Is it a symbiosis, or is it? I mean, is that violence, or maybe the better question is are the violence that you just noted, is it independent of that?
I would think it takes place independently too, I mean, because you have different aspects of it, right? I mean, you would have, as I said, because of the conflict, but you also have violence in the workplace. Now, I would think that maybe is not really directly connected to what you are talking about.
What is the violence in the work? I mean,
violence
how
in the
would
workplace, basically, you would have sexual harassment taking place in the workplace, and that we have found to be a fairly widespread problem. Of course, there are no statistics, because you know, you don't have statistics in this country. We don't have national statistics, but there have been studies done, micro studies done, where it has been found that there is a high incidence of sexual harassment. And I think one of the problems is that you know, many people don't understand what the definition of sexual harassment is, because it can vary from person to person. But I think one of the most important things to remember in sexual harassment is that usually we say it doesn't matter what the harasser intended, it is what the recipient felt that is important. So, you know, if the conduct is unwelcome.
I mean, a couple of questions arising out of that is, I mean, the first would be, you said that there are no statistics. Is the lack of any statistics indicative of the inability and unwillingness to look at this seriously?
It's possible, but it's not to say that there have not been efforts to try and actually gather some kind of national database on violence, incidents of violence.
Is it a definitional problem? Then?
Yes, definitional problem, but also, I mean, for example, there is right now, I think, an initiative with UNFPA, where they're working with the Ministry of Women's Empowerment to try and have sort of a national database, which we set up at the ministry, where, you know, basically violations would come in to the ministry, and they would collect the incidents of violence, an actual database that we could tap into. So that process is also taking place. It's slow, but it will happen in the next, I guess, in the next couple of years. And I think that would be very, very useful, because after all, whenever we talk about law reform or policy reform, the first question that a lawmaker or policy maker asks us is, where are the statistics? Tell us why you want this. And if we have actual statistics, then that would be useful, you know, to convince them or to urge them to come out, you know.
What are the micro-studies saying? What seems to be the key?
Well, basically, it's, as I said, you know, you would have domestic violence taking place. We have violence in the, you know, now with the IDP camps that have been set up, and as a result of the tsunami and the conflict, there has been incidents of violence there as well. Then you also have sexual harassment in the workplace. So there are micro-studies, as I said, and they are basically saying that there is violence taking place. Numbers-wise, it's difficult to actually tell you exactly.
Is there a gender disaggregation that, you know, who is committing which?
Well, generally it is a male towards a female. It is a male. It's not to say that there aren't very few scattered incidents of maybe same-sex violence taking place as well. Then you also have the lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual community also that would, I would think, be subject to violence in different forms. It may not be sexual, it may be other forms of violence, you know, so that also is there.
Is there any broad legislative, constitutional umbrella or mechanism or safety net to kind of capture or anchor these kinds of issues?
Oh yes, I mean the interesting thing is, Sanjana, that in this country we have a very plethora of laws actually that deal with violence against women, and I mean, and that is not to say that it's bad. It's very good.
And we were talking about the bill.
Yes, the domestic violence. I mean, you know, very few countries actually have an actual law on domestic violence, and we have that as of 2005.
That's right.
So, I mean, of course, it's now 4 years down the line, almost 5 years down the line, and the lack of implementation is a problem. So, separately, you have the Domestic Violence Act dealing with domestic violence, but then you also have the criminal law, which basically is very thorough. I mean, it's a very sort of comprehensive sections in the penal code, which actually look at different aspects of violence against women. You know,
so let me put it to you different. If you are subject to the type of violence that is enshrined in the bill and articulated in the legislative instruments, are the courts friendly towards that kind of process?
That's a tough question to answer, because I'd like to be positive on that, because I think you know.
But be realistic. Let's be negative.
Realistic, okay.
I mean, I know I'm just pushing you, but yes, but
yes. No, what I think is, I mean, you know, it's a slow process, and you know, we do say that there have been certain magistrates who have been, for example, unaware of the domestic violence law. But then it's not to say that they've not been keen on trying to find out more about it. So there have been instances we have been told by, for example, the Legal Aid Commission, and Women in Need, which is another organization that assists women to go to court, where they have encountered magistrates who have said, look, I don't know anything about this law, but give me some time, I'll go on the internet and look it up. Or they've been given a copy of the law and they've been willing to look at it and say, okay, we will look at it and now we will issue a protection order. So you have that kind of situation also taking place. But then you also have a situation where at the different levels of the court process, the hierarchy of courts, we have a male-dominated judiciary. So there itself, I mean, I think that itself says it all, that, you know, it is a further obstacle.
But a male-dominated judiciary can be nevertheless sensitive to these issues as well as being gender sensitive. Do you feel that the lack of perhaps campaign to raise awareness about the bill once it was actually put down in paper was a failing of the architects of it?
It's possible, but
maybe not the architects, but in the enactors.
Yes, but it's not just judiciary that needs to know about the law. That is the other issue. I mean, it's the police, it is the counsellors who are in court, it's the probation officers.
So there's a huge thing, isn't it?
It's a huge process. I mean, what about you know, those who provide counselling in the courts itself? You know, you have the female probation officers who are supposed to be there in the courts, appointed by the court to actually counsel.
Supposed to be the other usually.
Sometimes courts don't have probation officers. That's also an issue. So you have all these, you know, the support system that is necessary to implement the act missing. Then what happens? Because what we found is when we talk to Women in Need, for example, or Legal Aid Commission that go to court, they say these are the problems. There is a problem because some of the sort of safety mechanisms or the infrastructure is not available to actually implement the act.
When you were talking about violence in the workplace, this is state and private together.
Yes.
There is no difference in the types of violence or prevalence or incidences, frequency. Have the microstudies brought out any? Not
really. That has not really come out in that sense. But there have been some studies actually mainly in the private sector where they've gone to, you know, there have been studies where they've questioned women on what kind of harassment that they encounter. And they found that there have been a lot of women who have actually faced that, you know, harassment by their colleagues or by their superiors.
Now, tell me, I would hazard a guess that this would be quite prevalent in the free trade zone and the garment industry.
Yes, very much so. I mean, you know, that is one sector that is, you know, which is in a sense forgotten. I mean, you know, you tend to find that, you know, in spite of the fact that 80% of the free trade zone workers are women, you know, there isn't enough actually done for them. Similarly, it's like the migrant worker situation, you know, where you have females and they're not given enough support, you know, but here in the free trade zones, you have that.
And is it a big problem?
It is a fairly major problem. Of course, I don't think there have been any very recent studies on that, but there have been studies some time back where they've talked to women. You know, it's also, you know, taking the workplace as a whole, it is also the fact that when women leave their workplace and they go to their lodgings, that they encounter harassment on the way. Say, for example, when they're walking to their lodgings, that kind of situation also occurs.
So how do you change societal attitudes? I know that